ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. Welcome to today's class on Imam Ibrahim al-Halabi's work on intermediate Hanafi fiqh, Multaqa al-Abhur. And today we have a very important lesson in which we'll be looking at the section on forward sales, Babu Salam. But before we begin, there's a few questions that have been submitted that I wanted to address, and we will also give you an opportunity to ask related questions. So one was that, so there's a couple of questions. The first was, I'm a little bit confused on the issue of istihqaq. That what does it mean by rights arising? Istihqaq is basically defined, right? So we take things back to their definitions and we try in the class to share the core definition. So istihqaq is defined as ظهور حق ثالث, for a third party's right to become manifest. So we gave the example of a situation where someone sold property believing it belonged to them, but turns out that it was actually, they didn't, when it was gifted to them by their mother, it didn't actually belong to her legally. It belonged to her mother's first husband, for example. So they made a claim, and that has to be proven, which is why those principles that when such claims are made, a claim has to be proven. That's why he talked about a bayyina being a proof that applies to others. Right? Evidence, like two witnesses, contracts, title deed, etc. An admission, who does an admission apply to? An admission is limited to the one who makes the admission. If I said to Zubair, I admit that you owe me $1,000. Does that establish anything against the person I admit regarding? No. Right? So proof establishes a case or a right against another. An admission only counts against oneself. I can admit that I owe you money, but I can't admit that you owe me anything. That's just a claim. And a claim requires proof. And the third is that contradiction. You first say, you admit that you sold it. You admit that you sold the property, but then you claim that you didn't. This contradiction would be held against you. Right? Because your admission is accepted, the contradiction would not count for you in any way. So these are the principles that we took, and that's why they were mentioned, because when rights arise, people would dispute rights. And this particularly arises, as we mentioned, with respect to property. Okay. Babu Salam. Salam is fascinating because it goes against the qiyas, the basic assumption, a forward sale. The qiyas, the fundamental legal basis, is that qiyas, that salam should not be valid. Right? Should not be valid. So this is understanding, and this relates to one of the aims of the course, which is understanding fundamental issues in Islamic law and understanding Hanafi methodology. So we looked at certain principles related to sales. Can you sell something that you don't presently own?
No.
Can you sell something that into the future? No. So this is what Hanafis refer to as qiyas, the primary line of legal reasoning. Right? And it's important to distinguish there's a difference between qiyas in the usuli sense, right? Analogy. The fuqaha, when they use the term qiyas, they're often referring to something slightly distinct from this, which is they're referring to the primary line of legal reasoning. And they have this conceptual thinking, and they train us to think conceptually. That if there weren't specific texts related to this point, given what else we know in the Sharia, what would general religious, general legal reasoning lead us to affirm? General legal reasoning, would it affirm the Salam contract or not? No, it wouldn't. Because it's bay'ul ma'doom, right? It's selling something that we don't presently own, for example. So that's a problem, right? But why do we affirm it? We affirm it textually. We affirm it textually because it is affirmed through the Quran. From the longest verse in the Quran, what's called Ayatul Mudayana, from Surah Al-Baqarah. And you can see it referred to in Shaykh Zada's commentary. And because of specific hadiths about it. Also, because of specific hadiths about it, we would affirm that yes, the bay' as-salam, of this forward sale, is permissible. So it highlights this component of Hanafi fiqh, right? Of this idea of there being a primary line of legal reasoning, but it sort of conceptualizes that if there weren't specific texts related to this, what would legal reasoning result in? That's what's meant by qiyas there. And we'll see then how do we affirm it. We'll also see today a number of issues where the relied upon position is contrary to what is mentioned in the matan of the Multaqa here, and according to most of the late scholars of the madhab. And this is particularly on the issue of muddatus salam, the duration of the salam. And we'll be sharing some readings related to this as well, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Okay. So that's in terms of learning the course outcomes. And in this lesson, we look at the forward sales and what they're valid for. Gain clarity about the condition of forward sales, because there's specific hadiths mentioning what are the conditions of forward sales, and we'll see how the fuqaha allow those, how they define those. And so it's important to leave this lesson with clarity, number one, regarding what is a salam. What kind of things does it apply to? Number two, to know the terminology between the buyer, right, the seller, right, and the buyer is called Rabbus Salam or Al-Muslim, the seller Al-Muslim ilayhi, the object of the sale, which is called Muslim fihi. And this, of course, what subject would help you in being able to distinguish between these kinds of terminologies?
No.
No.
Oh, sarf.
Sarf, yeah, sarf. Nahu in the bigger sense. Sometimes it's called in Arabic taghlib. You mention nahu, but you mean nahu and sarf. So very often, if you had to mention one science that the Alfiya is in, Alfiyat ibn Malik, what would we say?
Nahu.
One science? Yeah. But we would make a correction and say, well, it is nahu and sarf. It is nahu and sarf. But this is often the issue of taghlib. You mention one, but you mean both. Right? So that's common in Arabic. Okay. But these are also things that the fuqaha explain, because sometimes usages don't necessarily follow the qiyas al-lughawi, right? So these are things to be very clear about. For those who like precision, which should be every talib ilm, of the classical works is a very beneficial work, and Sayyidi Abdul Latif will share the Dar al-Nafa'is edition. We've mentioned it previously. It's called Tilbatu Talaba by Abu Hafs al-Nasafi. By Imam Abu Hafs al-Nasafi, who was a great Hanafi scholar. He wrote Manzumat al-Khilaf in Hanafi fiqh. It's very influential. And he wrote a number of other important works. He was primarily a faqih, but his most famous work, what is it? Abu Hafs al-Nasafi?
متن عقائد النسفية.
Yeah, Matn Aqaid al-Nasafiyya. And he was not necessarily an imam in Aqaid, like we was clearly in fiqh, but because his text is based on very strong works. He studied with great scholars, and we can find biographical details regarding him. But his dictionary of legal terminology and the Dar al-Nafa'is edition has a very good index. Anyways, Abu Hafs al-Nasafi, it's also said one of his good friends saw him in a dream after death. So he asked him that, what did Allah do with you? ماذا فعل الله بك? Which is, because the righteous would be concerned about their akhirah. So they'd very often ask other people this question. ماذا فعل الله بك? What did Allah do with you? So he said, قد خيرني في السؤال. He gave me a choice when it came to the questioning of the two angels. So this is just a dream. Doesn't have. He said, وكيف ذلك? How was that? He said, the angels gave me the option of either answering in poetry or prose. So he chose poetry. So the angel said, you already know the questions. Go ahead. So it is said that he answered in poetry, and the person who saw this dream, he had never composed poetry, but when he related what he remembered from his dream, the poetry of Abu Hafs al-Nasafi from the dream, they said that sounds exactly like Abu Hafs al-Nasafi. He's also the author of a great tafsir, Taysir al-Tafsir, At-Taysir fi al-Tafsir, but that is not Tafsir al-Nasafi. Tafsir al-Nasafi is by Imam Hafiz al-Din al-Nasafi, who died 706 or 709 Hijri. So there's multiple great Nasafis in the Hanafi madhab. But Abu Hafs al-Nasafi. So that's a very useful resource. Okay. Getting back to, so these are some of these terms that and then there is Ra'sul Mal, which is the price. So keep those terms in mind. So let's look at forward sales, the definition, and what they are valid for. So, Babu Salam. Salam, of course, is from the rahmah of the Shara, that while in order to safeguard rights, right, إلا أن تكون تجارة عن تراض منكم, to avoid speculation and deceit and dispute, there are general conditions with respect to transactions. However, in some situations, people might not have the capital to produce, to make available what people want to buy. So, the salam is a way for people who want to engage in trade to be able to engage in trade so that they're paid up front and they secure the item within an agreed upon time. But the conditions laid out by, and this is something that the Arabs used to do during the time of the beloved Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But there was one fundamental difference, which they would engage in forward sales, but there was a lot of lack of clarity regarding this. So when there's lack of clarity, what would it result in?
Dispute.
Yeah, it would lead to dispute. So the conditions for the salam that we see in this chapter, what do they ensure?
Clarity.
They ensure clarity. So when there is this clarity, it results in there not being dispute. Right? That's why the conditions for salam are quite exacting. Number one. Right? Because it has to be defined a lot more than a regular item of sale is. Number one. Right? So the item has to be fully defined. Much more than a sale is defined. The term of delivery has to be defined. But can you just make anything into a salam? No. It has to be an item that is present in the market. An item that is present in the market. So even though it is not in the ownership necessarily of the person selling it, but it's effectively present because it's present in the market. So it's not bay' al-ma'doom completely. واضح? So if you look at the conditions, it has to be something that's very clearly defined and the like of it is present in the market. And you're making the payment up front. What will be the responsibility of the seller in this case then? The money they take? Yeah, I mean, it's theirs. But it would be akin to an amana that don't use it in other ways. Prioritize ensuring that the buyer's item is procured by it within the period of time. It's a price. It belongs to them. Technically, they could do other things, right? The salam could be for 3 months. They took that price, they bought and sold other things. Are they allowed to do that? Yes, because the price belongs to them. So it's not quite an amana, because an amana can you use for your own interests?
No.
And so there's a distinction between it being an amana or not. That's, of course, an important point. For example, I'm going next week to Istanbul. Let's say that the Masir gives me an envelope with $500 to give to someone over there. Can I, without Masir's permission, pay for my hotel? Well, I stay with my son, but pay for the hotel, pay for a couple meals, pay for a trip to Bursa with the $500 and say, okay, I'll withdraw $500 from my account and give that to the person?
Not without permission.
Not without permission. Right? So that's the difference between amana. Here, this is a payment. They can use it. Right? And they could agree. The person wants to make the sale, but they don't need it immediately. Right? So that's why understanding the conditions clearly, and Jazakallah khair for your participation. But this is why it's also sometimes referred to as bay'ul mafalis, right? The transaction of those who don't have money. But it also requires caution for the reasons mentioned. That you engage in all this stuff, but be careful because you have to be able to deliver the item ultimately. Okay. قال رحمه الله باب السلم. Now the salam in the Arabic language, right, is quite similar to the meaning in the Sharia, except that the Shari'i meaning is tighter. Right? In the Arabic language, pre-Islamic Arabic particularly, it's a sale where payment is given upfront and the item is given later. But both aspects of, the Sharia came and tightened that the payment has to be made upfront, as we will see. Number one. Number two, the delivery date has to be set, and there's other conditions regarding the specificity of the item. So that's so it's tighter. So he says, rahimahullah, Babu Salam huwa bay'u ajilin bi'ajil. Bay'u ajil bi'ajil. It's the sale of a deferred item for an upfront payment. And the ajil, right, the deferred item, i.e. the deferred item of sale, this is called al-muslamu fihi. And the ajil, the upfront payment, this is referred to as ra'sul mal. Ra'sul mal. And there's some useful terminology that you can find in Imam Haskafi's commentary. We shared it in the key concepts. Okay. So this is what it is. And it is established by the kitab, from Ayat al-Mudayana, and by the Sunnah. The Prophet sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam said, "Man aslama minkum falyuslim fi kaylin ma'lum wa waznin ma'lum ila ajalin ma'lum." And by the ijma', by consensus. But, and you can find this in Shaykh Zada, he says, وَيَأْبَاهُ الْقِيَاسِ. Right? And qiyas here, it would not be sound to translate qiyas as legal analogy, but this would be that legal reasoning in itself would entail it's not permissible, but it was left because of those particular texts. So this is a way of conceptualizing, as we explained, that if there weren't specific texts related to this, what would the general texts entail? Tamaman. So then he says, وَيَصِحُّ فِيمَا أَمْكَنَ ضَبْطُ صِفَّتِهِ وَمَعْرِفَةُ قَدْرِهِ. It is permissible, right? It's permissible, it is valid for items whose qualities and extent are possible to define. لا في غيره. Not in other items. So for example, can you make a salam in an art piece that you want to commission?
No.
No, right? Because you can't, can you do design work as salam? It's a trick question. Think about it a little bit. So if it was creative design work, right, they say, okay, I would like a website, you give general guidelines, and you'd like someone to come up with a proposal for that, but you've made a commitment, you've paid them up front for that. I'm sure you can see that a lot of dispute could arise, right? Because the qualities are not specifically defined. But it was very much, if it was just an implementation thing, that's a separate, could be a separate issue that would require considering. But it would be problematic because the qualities and extent are difficult to, that's why there's a separate contract which is called the manufacturing contract, that some things are valid regarding. Okay, and not for other items. Okay, So then he gives us examples of what it is valid for. So this fa is of tafriya. فيصح في المكيل والموزون سوى النقدين. So it is valid for those things sold by volume and weight, except for the naqdain, except for gold and silver. Because gold and silver there would be the meaning of riba in them. Okay. وفي العددي المتقارب, and for things sold by number, if they are similar, by number, by unit, if they are similar, and the mutaqarib is defined, العددي المتقارب is that whose individual units don't differ in price. Like eggs, are they all, like let's say you're in a place, eggs are sold by the dozen. But are the individual eggs all exactly the same? No. But do we measure the eggs? Oh, this is slightly bigger. This will be 52 cents. Oh, this one's kind of small. It's 48 cents. No. Right? That's called adadi mutaqarib. That even though its individual characteristics may vary a little bit, but it doesn't affect the individual price. That's the adadi al-mutaqarib. Right? كالجوز والبيض عددا وكيلا. Such as jows. What's a jows? Such as nuts or eggs, whether they're sold by number, by units, or by volume. And nuts come in different sizes, like let's say coconuts, and different urf applies differently. And he says, وَكَذَا الْفُلُوسِ خِلَافًا لِمُحَمَّدٍ. And likewise, you could do salam in base currency, contrary to Imam Muhammad. How would you do salam in base currency? You say, okay, I'll pay you. And of course, the currencies had fluctuating values, right? So you had the value of gold, the value of silver, and the value of fulus would fluctuate even relative to themselves. So some trader needed a lot of loose change. They went to someone and said, I'll pay you 100 dirham for 800 units of whatever fulus payable to me within a week. Or how, according to, because fulus was not really a measure of trade. Right? Fulus, base currency, it was just loose change. So a trader would need it for what? To top up a transaction. Typically. That's why, as we mentioned, fulus, someone could have a pocket full of fulus and they would be considered broke. Muflis. لا يملك إلا الفلوس. A broke person, they may have pocketfuls of base currency, but contrary to Imam Muhammad. But when the use of fulus became widespread, what was the fatwa on with respect to riba applying in fulus? Does it apply in fulus as well or no? Remember, يجوز بيع فلس بفلسين خلافا لمحمد. We took that earlier, correct? Yes. So the same thing, in our times, you couldn't, like we don't have this category of fulus, right? But, so the Arab ulama generally take the thing that modern currencies are a thaman istilahan, so they're akin to gold and silver, The closer to the Hanafi position is that they're like al-fulus al-ra'ija, they're like base currency in circulation, but the fatwa has been since the time of al-Kamal ibn al-Humam in the 9th century that riba applies to fulus, and therefore you couldn't do salam in fulus in this way. And people wouldn't do that in our times anyways, practically. Okay. That's the fulus issue. وفي اللبن والآجر إذا سمي ملبن معلوم. And you can also do it in al-labin. What is al-labin? And of course, labin here is with a kasra, not
The
laban.
kasra is for building, like bricks.
Yeah. So al-laban is, so they would have two types of building blocks, right? You had raw building blocks and cooked, like raw bricks, like clay or mud bricks, and you'd have cooked bricks. So the raw bricks, the uncooked bricks, what would they be called? So of course it shouldn't say milk, right? Abdul Latif, could you send a screenshot of this to my assistant teacher for this and tell them about this?
Yes.
They share a last name with me. You're like his uncle, so you could tell him off too. But al-labin, right? Al-labin is الطوب النيء. It is uncooked bricks. And ajur is اللبن إذا طبخ. It is cooked bricks. One of the interesting things, of course, many of the ulama wanted to avoid government positions. And they wanted to be obscure and dedicate themselves to devotion, teaching, writing. So they chose the names of lowly professions. In Iraq, the great Iraqi Hanafis tended to have lowly names. Al-Quduri, the one who deals with qidr, like pots. Al-Khassaf, Al-Jassas, the one who deals with jis. Right? All these kinds, Al-Khassaf, all these kinds of names, all related to menial, simple professions. Whereas the ulama of the outlying areas, right, ma wara an-nahar, in what's called Transoxania, they would have big titles, Shamsul A'imma, Fakhrul Islam, etc. Because those lands, you had to have leaders, had to be strong and praised. And you see that tendency in other lands as well. Right? And we shouldn't apply our standards to them in judging these kinds of things. Right? So it's valid in uncooked or cooked bricks if one mentions a known melbin, a known source, right? Right? I.e., if they are defined in a way that does not customarily lead to dispute, because different types of melbins, brick factories would make different kinds of bricks. And how that would be defined returns ultimately to custom, right? So they're sufficiently defined. In many societies, you have standards, a standard X size brick or this type of brick, so that it does not lead to dispute. وفي المذروع كالثوب إن بين طوله وعرضه ورقعته. And in things sold by length, like cloth, if one mentions its length and its width and the quality of the cloth. In terms of what type of threads, right? Because like, for example, with cotton, depending on the density of the thread, it has greater value. Right? So رقعته, as Sheikh Zada says, is غلظته. Its thickness. Right? So its qualities. Right? Right? Its qualities. And then he says, وفي السمك المليح وزنا ونوعا معلومين. And in salted fish, by mentioning its weight and known type and type, and of course there's a note mentioned because some Hanafi scholars use the term malih, السمك المالح, and in terms of strict classical Arabic, it's supposed to be malih. Okay, so they would, to preserve fish, because fish spoils quickly, it was very common across the world to salt the fish. Like the famous Portuguese, salted cod. But it was وكذا الطري في حينه فقط, and likewise with fresh fish only when fresh. ولا يجوز فيهما عددا, and it's not valid in salted fish or fresh fish by number. Why? Because numerically fish vary in size and quality, etc., etc. ولا في الحيوان وأطرافه, and one cannot make salam in an animal or its parts, because animals vary. 2 sheep would be different. 2 sheep legs would be different, etc. ولا في الجلود عددا, nor in hides of animals in number. Right? ولا في الحطب حزما, right? والرطبة جزرا, nor in wood, right? Like for firewood, for example, whether it be in like in stacks of it or bundles of it, because the particulars vary. This is if the particulars vary, but what if they have standard that they cut the logs into standard size blocks? Then the governing principle would apply, as we took. ولا في الجوهر والخرز, right? Nor in jewels والخرز. What is خرز, سادتي? Right? خرز بفتحتين, right? Because like small gems, because the individual units differ. But here, when it comes to jewels and gems, like small gemstones, they say that unless they are sold by weight or volume or something like that, but then it goes back to the same principle, right? But individual items of those would vary. So these are all lots of examples of the same thing. So he's giving lots of examples. He says, وَلَا فِي اللَّحْمِ طَرِيًّا, nor in raw meat. Why? What's the problem with raw meat?
Individual differences.
Right? Yeah. Because, let's say, because meat may not be present. It's okay, I'm going to sell you, let's say you enter into a Salam contract for 30 kilos of organic buffalo meat, of organic bison meat. We may not be able to find it. So the concern, that's why if you read in Majma' al-Anhur, there's some discussion that the fear is that it may not be deliverable. But, so the khilaf, is it so real? There's some discussion. But practically, this is Imam Abu Hanifa's position. وَقَالَا, the Sahibain said, يَصِحُّ إِذَا وُصِفَ مَوْضِعٌ مَعْلُومٌ مِنْهُ بِصِفَةٍ مَعْلُومَةٍ. It would be allowed if specific parts of the meat were defined with specific qualities. So one example of that would be, and we're coming that the conditions include the like of it needs to be present in the market. So, when it comes to meat, for example, different countries have different grading systems for meat. So let's say it's a AAA, beef, steaks, this number of ounces, all these things. So the quality is defined customarily, the weight is defined, so it will be valid. So the fatwa here, as you see in the two commentaries, is on the position of Imam Abu Hanifa, of the Sahibain. But is this a real khilaf? No. Because often the khilaf is a matter of different consideration. Abu Hanifa's consideration is that meat would not be sufficiently, it's either not defined or potentially not deliverable. But later, as people complicated their trade and so on, even in the generation of the Sahaba, of his Sahibain, this was done much more, so there wasn't dispute, and there was a degree of standardization of these things, so it didn't lead to dispute. So the fatwa is on the position of the Sahibain, and they quote that this is what's mentioned in the Bahr al-Ra'iq and Sharh al-Majma', Sharh Majma' al-Bahrain. Okay. And then he says, وَلَا يَجُوزُ السَّلَمْ بِكَيْلٍ أَوْ ذِرَاعٍ مُعَيَّنٍ لَا يُدْرَى قَدْرُهُ. Because the extent has to be known. We cannot do salam using a measure like a kale or units of length that they don't know how much. How? You go to a cloth store and they says, I'll sell you 10 of this stick worth of cloth like this, deliverable in a month. Now that stick could get stolen, so it would lead to dispute. Now if they know that stick is this measure, etc., then you define it in that way. But if its qadr is known, it would not be an issue. وَلَا فِي طَعَامِ قَرْيَةٍ أَوْ تَمْرِ نَخْلَةٍ مُعَيَّنَةٍ or مُعَيَّنَةٍ. Nor can you make salam in the food of a particular village or the dates of a specific tree. Right? They said this is if it's that specific village or town, if there's fear that it would not be deliverable, i.e. it's not found in the marketplace. So ultimately that it does not fulfill the conditions. Amongst them is that the like of it will be found from the time of the contract till the time of delivery in the marketplace. Whether in the marketplace or in the storehouses. So it's effectively exists. It's out there. So there's a danger if it's from one specific village it might get sold out, for example. But if this ascription is simply for the type of food, right? So you say, or there's so much of it that it's not conceivable that it be not found. For example, Camembert cheese. Camembert cheese legally is only from the Camembert region. In most of the world, it's a protected name. But typically, you guys familiar with Camembert cheese? Okay. Or Parmesan cheese, for example, right? Or Parmigiano Reggiano, it's from a particular region in Italy. But is it conceivable that in any big city, there'd be no Parmigiano Reggiano cheese available?
Not likely.
Not likely. When it's not found in the city, you couldn't make salam in it. Right? So this would be in the case of there's one particular village, there's a small amount, because you could get sold out. But when that consideration does not arise, so these are examples. Examples don't always have to be fulfilled because they're built on underlying considerations, as we've tried to illustrate. ولا فيما لا يبقى من حين العقد إلى حين المحل with a كسرة, right? محل, nor from that which does not last from the time of the contract to the time of delivery. Okay? Perishable items, right? Because they're to be found right now, but 2 months from now, they may or may not be available in the market. That would be something that is found at the time of the contract and would also be found when the due date is there. Okay, so these are examples, and then they mention the conditions, right? So this illustrates many, many examples. وَشَرْطُهُ, and its conditions. And right, so that's what we look at in part 2, the conditions of forward sales. So he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, وَشَرْطُهُ, and these are 8. And these are شرائط الصحة. And they're 8 or 9. Right? So 8 are mentioned in the method, and there's a 9th condition as well. So the 8 are mentioned in the method. So he says, بيان الجنس كبر أو شعير, specifying the category, such as it being bur, wheat, or barley. والنوع, and the type, such as كسقية أو بخسية. Right? سقية refers to what, Sadati? Right? Saqiyya is that which was watered using naturally. Bakhsiyya is using sayh, like irrigation. Bakhsiyya is that which was watered just by rain. Because that which, plants grown through irrigation tend to be fuller than those that just relied on rain, but without any irrigation, typically. So al-bakhs huwa al-qilla. Right? Because can you always rely on rain in most lands? No. So it's bakhsiyya, so it'd be wheat, but it didn't have the same amount of watering as wheat grown on fully irrigated land, for example. Tamaman. So you have to mention the jins, the genus, the general category, and then the naw', the type. And you also have to define wasifa, right? And its quality. كجيد ورديء, right? Of good quality or low quality. And that would be according to what is customarily done for the like of that in the marketplace. والقدر, and the quantity. نحو كذا رطلا أو كيلا, this number of ritl or this volume. بما لا ينقبض ولا ينبسط, in things that neither compress significantly nor expand significantly. Why? Because things that compress and expand significantly, it would lead to dispute. Right? And that would again return to to what the market accepts and what doesn't accept. Okay. And then, so those are four. The fifth condition is the duration. وَأَجَلٍ مَعْلُومٍ, and a known period, a known duration for the contract. And he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, وَأَقَلُّهُ شَهْرٌ فِي الْأَصَحِ, and the minimum duration of the deferral, because what's the definition of salam, Sadati?
بيع آجل بعاجل.
Yeah, بيع عاجل بيع آجل بيع آجل, selling something in the future, بعاجل, for a price due up front. Correct? So the deferral of the item due has to be defined. بأجل معلوم. And that's what's come in the hadith. And also in the Quranic verse, it's understood. It's also referring to debt, but it's also referring to the salam. Yeah. So then there's difference of opinion. Is the salam a regular contract? Is this a regular contract? Or is it an exceptional contract? Yeah, it's a special sale. It's an exceptional sale. The wisdom of legislating it is because people have need for deferring transactions. Particularly, why would the seller, particularly the interest of the seller, they want to bring in some capital to be able to trade in it, and then I'll deliver that to you in due time. So it's established out of need. So the reason most of the scholars of the Hanafi madhab settled after much discussion, that's why it's al-asah. There's various positions on it. They settled on a month. And why did they settle on a month? Because less than a month was not customarily a period of deferral. Number one. So the need for the salam would not arise because of that. But if we look at this, there's a few things. The first being that textually, is the month mentioned in the primary texts? In the hadiths? No. Now, we don't make ijtihad, but it's important to be aware of that. So the primary texts themselves do not mention a month, nor was that deduced by the mujtahid imams of the madhab. And this is where, it's very important to realize that just because ijtihad has taken place, and are we going to do ijtihad ourselves? See, Abdul Latif, any ijtihad plans in the near future?
Not for me.
No, right? And no. But, so does it mean we don't need to be aware of what the primary texts are that these rulings are based on? No, we need to know.
You still need.
Because you need to know what is the ruling based on. Because it could be based textually, it could be based on custom. And then it's also important to say, okay, I just need to know the rulings. I don't need to understand the reasoning. What's the problem there? If you don't know the reasoning, say, well, the fuqaha said it, the minimum is a month. Okay. But why did they say it's minimum a month? Right? So it could be based on something deduced from the texts, could be deduced from general principles, or it could be because that's a prevalent custom. So that's why understanding the reasoning is important. So here there's a few things, and you can see this discussion in Sheikh Zada in some details, which is also why fiqh-wise simply saying, well, Imam al-Haskafi says, alayhi al-fatwa. Okay, good. على العين والرأس. But that does not have much bearing, particularly in certain chapters, right? Because transactions are built upon the interests of people and the customs of people. Without while considering texts, right? While considering texts, the primary texts. So when we look at Zahir al-Riwayah from our Imams, there is nothing explicit in Zahir al-Riwayah, right, the primary transmission of the madhab, regarding the minimum period of Salam. That's number one. It's not there in Zahir al-Riwayah. There are various narrations from Imam Muhammad and others, but they vary. And then the ulama differed on what the bases of those are. So there's some narrations that it's 3 days. Some said 10 days. They said at least half a day. Right? Some said that it goes back to the minimum that a salam is needed for, which is theoretically very nice. There's a position of Imam al-Karhi. But the problem is, how do we define that? It would lead people to be confused, and if there's confusion, dispute would arise, correct? So what do we do? So generally they said the least need would be a month. Less than that, they found customarily that there was not need for it. So the exceptional contract remains exceptional to the extent of the recognized need. Tamaman. So the fatwa in our times, as you can see in the Majallat al-Ahkam al-Adliya, is that any defined period is sufficient. Any defined period is sufficient. And we'll be sharing the PDF of the related items of the Majalla. So those who would like to read it there, right? But why? Because in our times, with the speed of manufacture, the speed of transportation, and many other factors, it's very possible to have this kind of transaction that a seller who needs to procure these items, they're in the market, they didn't have the money, they can secure them in quick time. So it could be any defined period is sufficient, and that's the fatwa position. So this highlights that just because the matan says it does not mean it is absolute. That's why fiqh is based on understanding. Interestingly, of course, if you does Imam al-Quduri mention a minimum period for salam in Mukhtasar al-Quduri? Most people, of course, engage in religious tourism when it comes to their Islamic studies.
Isn't it a little better?
Yeah, good stuff. Proud of you folks. Good. People, did you prepare that or you knew it?
Both.
Good. Very good. Right? Alhamdulillah. That's how talib al-ilm should be. Jazakallah ta'ala khairan. Right? So, may Allah grant you guys and all of us tawfiq and sadat. Okay. So that's the issue. So it highlights this issue that, now of course it doesn't mean that khalas, we can't come up with whatever, but we need to understand fiqh. You have to, so this is understanding what the mutun say, what the shuruh say, but what do they mean? So that's why one has to know what are the primary, we have awareness of the reasoning, the basis, and the reasoning and the basis and the source texts it's based on. So what is the scope here? And also, how is this applied in our times? And we'll see many other examples. We've seen a number of examples of where the fatwa in the Hanafi school changes, but it doesn't just change randomly. That ruling's inconvenient, we won't follow it. A lot of it's based on the considerations change. Okay. And then conditions 6 and 7, he says, وقدر رأس المال إذا كان كيليا أو وزنيا أو عدديا, and specifying the extent of the price if the price was based on volume, scale, or weight, or number. Because the price does not have to be only money. And even in recent years, many companies exchange goods between themselves. So let's say there's a bookstore or let's say there's one brother who sells perfumes and another who sells scarves. They enter into a salam arrangement for definable items. But the payment is this number of units of a very clearly defined standard oud. Or standard, let's say, this is a well-known type of rose jasmine that, let's say, commonly in that country it's available, it's known, defined. So it's defined very clearly. You could do salam where the price of the salam is a commodity by weight, volume, or number. واضح؟ فلا يجوز في جنسين بلا بيان رأس مال كل منهما. So it's not allowed in two, the رأس المال, the price cannot be from two categories without mentioning how much it is of each. ولا بنقدين بلا بيان حصة كل منهما من المسلم فيه. So you cannot say I'll pay you in two currencies without mentioning the extent of each one. Without mentioning the extent of each one with respect to the Muslim fihi. ومكان الإيفاء إن كان له حمل ومؤنة, and mentioning where the item will be delivered if it's something that has a cost of transportation. Right? Like if it requires transport, cost and effort to transport it. And then details on the delivery, he tells us rahimahullah ta'ala, وعندهما لا يشترط معرفة قدر رأس المال إذا كان معينا. And the Sahibain said, you don't have to mention how much the price is if it is, if it's specified, i.e., for example, it's present. Right? If it's present. ولا مكان الإيفاء, nor do you have to mention where the item is deliverable. ويوفيه في مكان عقده, and in that case you would deliver the item where the contract was. But you see, Imam Abu Hanifa's position is more cautious. But which one is given fatwa upon? It would depend on custom. That if not specifying where the item is deliverable, where the item is deliverable, because if you purchased let's say 50 book stands of a very standard type that, let's say in that country, let's say bookshelves, very standard bookshelves, defined, etc. The seller, where would they want the item delivered? Where would they want the item to be picked up?
At their warehouse.
Yeah, at their warehouse or store. But the buyer, what would they say? I understood that. Where would you want your bookshelves to be? Delivered at home. So it could lead to dispute, right? So this would depend on the type of item, and is there a clear custom that's established? So if there's a clear custom that the place of delivery is known, then the position of the Sahibain would apply. Anytime there isn't a clear custom, the position of Abu Hanifa is more precautionary. Right? تماما. Then he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, وَمِثْلُهُ الثَّمَنِ وَالْأُجْرَةِ وَالْقِسْمَةِ, and the same thing applies to the price and the ujra and the payment, the payment for lease or hire or employment contract, and qisma, right? That where is payment due? Right? So if the payment's deferred, we have to make clear how the payment will take place. In a good contract, right? So for example, if Zubaydah is working in a remote job, she's earning in euro, let's say. It would be good contractual practice to specify how the payment will be made. Because imagine she's working for a company based out of Vienna. So the company says, you haven't paid me. So come, but Zubaydah lives in Toronto. She's working remotely for a company in Vienna. So imagine if they said, come, you can pick up your payment anytime you want. So she only works 10 hours a week for a remote job. Is it conceivable for her to go and pick it up from their headquarters in Vienna? Of course not. So it's good contractual practice to agree where these various categories, these various things, where the price would be paid. This is referring to the thaman. This is referring to the deferred price. The deferred price, where it would be paid. The ujra, where would, the rent or the the ujra, it could refer to rent or lease or salary or wages, be paid. And likewise, if a qisma, if an apportionment of wealth was happening, where would it be? Where would someone take their share of that apportioned property? The good practice is to steer clear of the dispute in general by pre-specifying. وَمَا لَا حَمْلَ لَهُ يُوَفِّيهِ حَيْثُ شَاء فِي الْأَصَحِ اتِّفَاقًا. And things that don't have any cost to the transportation, one could deliver it wherever one wished, i.e. within the city, and but if they specified a place, it would be better, as Maulana al-Haskafi quotes. And the eighth condition is taking possession of the price. This is a key condition. وَقَبْضُ رَأْسِ الْمَالِ قَبْلَ التَّفَرُّقِ شَرْطُ بَقَائِهِ. And the eighth condition is that taking possession of the رأس المال, of the price, before the two part from the majlis, is a condition for the contract to remain valid. Right? Because you can make the contract, then you say, okay, let's have lunch, let's discuss. While they're both still together physically, that's okay. But once they part, the contract is no longer a valid contract because it goes against the very basis of this exceptional contract. So that is the salam. فلو أسلم مئة نقدا ومئة دينا على المسلم إليه في كر بطل في حصة الدين فقط. So if one made salam of 100 payable upfront, which is the basis, and 100 payable as a debt, meaning in the future, with respect to the Muslim ilayhi. What's the Muslim ilayhi again, folks? Right.
The seller.
The seller, good. Then it would be invalid with respect to the amount payable later. Right? And of course, it would be an impermissible transaction. So now there's details related to forward sales that we will close with. That ولا يجوز التصرف في رأس المال أو المسلم فيه قبل قبضه. That one cannot, it's not permissible to transact in the price nor item of sale, right, before taking possession of it. How? بشركة أو تولية, by entering into partnership in it, or by selling it at cost, i.e. before taking ownership of it, because it prevents qabd, which is a shart. Right? ولا يجوز شراء شيء من المسلم إليه برأس المال بعد التقايل قبل قبضه. Nor can you buy something from the seller with the price by taqayul. Taqayul is by letting one payment annul the other. Right? So what happens? What's the scenario? You make salam in 20 for 100 of these double-walled cups, fully defined. We gave a namudaj or an unmudaj, right? A sample, but we defined the type, the quality, the brand, all these things. So we defined everything. We fulfilled the conditions of the salam. So let's say the 100 cups, $1,000 payment is due. When does the payment have to be made? The cups are deliverable in 1 month.
Upfront.
Upfront. Okay, so I, as the buyer, owe Uncle Latif $1,000. I have to pay it. But then I say, by the way, but I'm a trader. So I say, okay, listen, I owe you $1,000. Why don't you buy? I show him a copy of the new commentary because we were both traders, but I'm a bookseller. In the example, not in real life. Show him a copy of the new commentary on the Ihya, etc. The new edition of the commentary of the Ihya. Very disappointing. The old edition may be more useful. Anyways, he said, "Oh, I'd like to buy that." I said, "I also have a good copy of this." So I sell him 3 books for $1,000. 3 large book collections. And taqayul would be what? Is cancelling one debt by the other. Can you do that? When one of the transactions was a salam, what's the problem with doing so? So we made salam with these cups, correct? Deferred to 31, let's say 30, 31 days. And what is due up front? $1,000. Now, instead of paying the $1,000, if I sold $1,000 worth of books to Uncle Latif, can we just say, look, I owe you 1,000, you owe me 1,000. Let's cancel one for the other. What's the problem here when it comes to salam?
The price is due, not the books.
Yeah, but normally you can cancel one sale for the other. If it wasn't a salam, could we do this?
No.
Yeah, you can. Just imagine, I sell you this cup for 1 cup. I'll sell it to you for $15. I don't know how much these cups are for. I didn't actually buy it, but let's say for $15. You sold me a sibha for $15. So how much do I owe Uncle Masir? $15. How much does he owe me? $15. Do we both, in a regular sale, right, not salam, do we have to actually exchange the payments?
No, one can wipe out the other.
Yeah, one can wipe out the other. That's taqayul. One cancelling the other. But if we do this taqayul, where one or both transactions are a salam, what are we vitiating? What condition are we vitiating, breaking? You'd pointed to this, which is making the payment upfront. The payment actually has to be made upfront, because the other transaction could be cancelled. The item, after we made the transaction, I could say, look, these are really good sibhas. I'm not going to bite on it. I bit on it. The thread broke. Then it can lead to all kinds of problems. So, and in general, the exceptional remains exceptional and is limited in its consideration, especially in matters based on caution. Okay. So then he tells us about issues of measurement and delivery. وَلَوْ اشْتَرَى قُرًّا وَأَمَرَ رَبَّ السَّلَمِ بِقَبْضِهِ قَضَاءً لَا يَصِحْ. So he says, if the seller buys something of volume and tells the buyer to take possession, this is invalid delivery. Right? So what's the scenario? Right? What's the problem here? Sadati? Hmm? Right? 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 Because there's a couple of issues. Here, right? One is that you're selling that which, the seller has to take possession of the item first before they deliver it, right? That's one of the aspects, right? And it can lead to dispute in other ways as well. There's ways around this. وَلَوْ أَمَرَ مُقْرِضَهُ بِذَلِكَ صَحَّ. Right? But you can do that with a debt, like with a loan. That pay it from such and such, collect it from such and such person, that would be valid. وَكَذَا لَوْ أَمَرَ رَبَّ سَلَمِهِ بِقَبْضِهِ لَهُ ثُمَّ لِنَفْسِهِ فَاكْتَالَهُ لِأَجْلِ الْمُسْلَمِ إِلَيْهِ ثُمَّ لِنَفْسِهِ صَحَّ. So the way to make this valid would be to break it in two, right? Then you say first, could you take possession of that for me? So the buyer takes possession of it, but on behalf of whom? Of the seller. But then they have to verify, because the other danger is you have to verify that the item delivered is to the quality and the amount and the the characteristics that it is. Are buyers always satisfied with items that they receive?
Rarely.
No, they would want better. So it would very easy. So you'd go take possession of it from over there. Say, no, it wasn't the right quality. But I ate some. So it was the wrong amount. And if you recall, things sold by weight, on condition of weight and volume, what has to be done before the buyer starts using it? It needs to be measured. Right? It needs to be weighed or measured, lest it lead to dispute. So for this, right, just go pick it up from there and start using it. There's all kinds of dispute that could arise. The way to do it, because the guy says, okay, it's due. So, it's still at the warehouse. If you want to say, you can go collect. So I can pick it up end of the day. So, no, I need it now. So you can go pick it up. So can go pick it up on my behalf. But before you use it, let's weigh it. Bring it here and let's weigh it. Or the seller could appoint someone to go on their behalf to be present when it's weighed, so that it wards off the possibility of dispute. As an aside, although it's not related to Salam, but if you get food delivery, etc., it's a common thing and leads to dispute that as soon as the food arrives, check out that everything is complete. It's not always possible to ask the delivery guy, poor guy, they have lots of orders that are there, underpaid and overworked. This whole gig economy thing is not exactly just, or not exactly fair. Just is a big word. But as soon as you can, before eating, you should check that everything is complete. If it's not, the least one should do is inform, whatever the delivery company was, that, by the way, the food came incomplete. Don't take, some people eat it and then they tell the company and they threaten to put a bad review. Muslims, we safeguard rights, but we're not gangsters. We don't, we don't believe in the law of the jungle. We believe in the law of God. So, that's important. Okay, so these are the considerations related to measurement and delivery. Also, ولو اكتال المسلم إليه في ظرف رب السلم بأمره وهو غائب لا يكون قبضا. But if one measures, if the seller told to use the buyer's measurement in absence, it doesn't count as taking possession. ولو اكتال البائع كذلك كان قبضا. Right? But if the seller in non-forward sales does this, it counts as taking possession. بخلاف ما لو إذا اكتاله في ظرف نفسه أو في ناحية بيته. So these are details. Another case of measurement is ولو اكتال الدين والعين في ظرف المشتري إن بدأ بالعين كان قبضا وإن بدأ بالدين فلا. Okay? So all of these go back to the issue of measurement and ensuring that it is measured as part of the delivery so that dispute does not arise. So if someone did a salam on X number of computers, right, with specific specifications, for example, measure it before they part. You can't just say, okay, take it home and take it, and then tell me if everything was fine. But then it will lead to dispute, and all kinds of other problems would arise, right? And it breaks the conditions of the salam, which are strict. Conditions of the salam are stricter than the conditions of sales. Right? So these are يعني وعندهما صح قبض العين فإن شاء رضي بالشركة وإن شاء فسخ البيع. These are conditions of what if disputes arise. What if ولو أسلم أمة في كر وقبض ثم تقايلا فماتت قبل ردها بقي التقايل وتجب قيمتها يوم قبضها. A forward sale for volume of wheat, right? Right? So actually the forward sale of an amma, where the price is the is the amma, and she dies, then, but they also engage in muqayala, one transaction for the other. This is what would happen, right? ولو ماتت ثم تقايلا صح التقايل. Right? If she dies first before they cancelled one transaction for the other, this would happen. وكذا المقايضة في الوجهين. Right? Same thing with just a simple exchange contract as well. بخلاف الشراء بالثمن فيهما. So this you can think through the issue. We don't have ima, so that's now how do we handle claims in forward sales? These are ولو ادعى أحد عفوا لو ادعى أحد عاقدي السلم بيان الأجل أو اشتراط الرداءة وأنكر الآخر فالقول لمدعيها مطلقا. So if one of the two transacting parties in the salam claims a certain بيان يعني السلام بيان الأجل, right? A certain duration, that it was 30 days. Right? So the one claiming would claim a longer time, let's say. أو اشتراط الرداء, or the seller said that no, you only, what we had agreed upon was a lower quality. And who would claim a lower quality? The seller. وأنكر الأجل وعفوا أنكر الآخر, sorry, and the other denied that. فالقول لمدعيها مطلقا. So here the word of the one claiming it would be taken. And for the one claiming the time period or claiming the lower quality. Right? Because the one making the claim is arguing for the validity, right? And that's the basis. So his word would be taken. So one says that there is an ajal, it's deferred, and that's the basis. So his word would be taken. The one claiming the lower quality, that is the basis, unless the other has proof that it's more. Of course, salam should be written down because it lends itself to dispute. وقال للمنكر إن كان رب السلم إن كان أي المنكر رب السلم في الأول أو المسلم إليه في الثاني. And the Sahibain differed on this. They said the word of the one denying would be taken if it's the Rabbus Salam with respect to the deferral period, and the one denying if it's the Muslim ilayhi when it comes to the quality. But the position of Imam Abu Hanifa is taken on this. Now there's another issue which we'll touch upon briefly, which is in the next lesson, and that will be the last lesson of this term, which is on the manufacturing contract, a number of assorted issues. The section on Masail Shatta, and that will take us, and the Masail Shatta will take us up to Sarf. So we'll continue from there. I know that there's some related questions that would arise. I skipped over a little bit of the issues related to weights because they don't have that many considerations, but making sure things are weighed before they're given out. The basic issue is lest it lead to dispute. Manufacturing contracts are also of great. They're a lot more flexible than Salam contracts, but both of these give us a great opportunity. And the great opportunity is that, as an ummah, we have to start thinking, and as individuals, right? The ummah is made up of individuals. We have to be thinking about starting our own tijara, our own enterprises. Not necessarily just as that's all we do to earn money, but even on the side, having ways that we have economic independence is important. And this is something that women would do historically. There are, across the Muslim world, there are manuals written for women. What are the rulings women need to know? A lot of times people say, well, women need to know hayd and nifas and these kinds of things and childbearing, etc. But consistently, these manuals, and one example of that is this a manual written for largely illiterate or semi-literate women in the subcontinent called Heavenly Ornaments, has all the chapters on trade and partnerships and the different modes of financing. Why? I asked one of the great scholars of the Pakistani subcontinent, said only a woman who is not thinking about her own best interests would not be looking to secure herself financially. So yes, let's say she's in a circumstance where she is a homemaker. She is Rabbatul Bayt. She is a mother. But what happens if her husband dies in an accident? And she's not worked for 15 years. She has no source of income, etc. So this is something that across traditional Muslim societies would be the case, and we've been affected a lot by colonialism in all kinds of ways. I mean, we've been affected by it in our diets. If you know about South Asian diet, for example, just think about curries from the subcontinent without tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, and all of these came during the colonial age. I mean, some of them started with the Portuguese who got there very early, but even our diets, the types of staple food crops we depend upon, the types of wheat, etc. So this affected our diet, but also affected many of our social and economic habits. So these are important things to be aware of for every believer to be thinking. And there's a hath على التجارة, right? There's an encouragement to have economic independence. Partial or complete, that's a separate matter. We will stop there. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. We'll take Sayyidi Abdul Latif's question. Go ahead, Sayyidi.
I was wondering any recommended reading that where the scholars distinguish between qiyas from the fuqaha and the scholars of usul.
Again, it's just to read the two. Like, how do the scholars of usul define qiyas is discussed in the books of usul al-fiqh. We covered it in Mukhtasar al-Manar, in Samt al-Wusul, etc. Right? And then the usage of qiyas in the works of fiqh is found in the works of fiqh. So you take the definition and explanation of one, the definition and explanation of the other, and you contrast the two, and you see that the two usages are distinct. I mean, there's some overlaps, but they're distinct. We had touched upon this in the classes we did on the Hanafi way, where we covered the Imam al-Kawthari's work, Imam Muhammad Zahid al-Kawthari's work, فقه أهل العراق وحديثهم. وجزاكم الله تعالى خيرا والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.